Hello, my name's Kingsley Singleton and welcome to this video lesson from Digital Photo, the UK's best-selling photography and imaging magazine. In this tutorial, we're going to look at creating a landscape image using the exposure blending mode in Photomatics. And by applying this method, we'll end up with a nicely balanced shot that keeps detail in the highlights like the sky and also the shadow areas like the landscape itself. We'll also be making some subtle improvements to the shot in elements after it's finished processing. Now, the exposure blending mode is quite different to the HDR tone mapping feature that you'll also find in Photomatics, and it won't tend to produce quite the same level of detail enhancing that goes on in a properly tone mapped HDR image. There are benefits to using the exposure blending mode though, because in this method there's less chance of amplifying digital noise, and also less chance of producing ugly halos and grey patches on your shot. It also gives you the option of producing more traditional looking pictures that, while still balancing the highlights and the shadows, are a little easier on the eye than some HDR results. Something else that's different from the regular HDR tone mapping route is that we're not going to use two separately exposed shots. Instead, we're going to use two JPEGs converted from the same RAW file. And this means you can use this technique on images not specifically shot for the purpose and avoid having to trundle about with your tripod. Okay, so before we start our exposure blending in Photomatics, we need to create our two separate JPEGs from the same RAW file. So first come up to File and down to Open, and then we're going to open the RAW file called Stanage Edge. And first things first, in the camera raw interface, let's make sure that preview is ticked so we can see the changes we're making on the right hand side taking place on the image itself. And we'll also make sure that we're viewing the image just as it was recorded by the camera, just by coming over to Settings, down to Camera Raw Defaults, make sure that's highlighted, and then untick these auto boxes. And there we have it. That's the image exactly as it was shot. Not much to look at really, is it? There is detail in the sky and the landscape, but they're not very well balanced. But we'll soon take care of that by making our two conversions and combining them in Photomatics. And in the first of these conversions that we're going to make, we're going to concentrate on the landscape rather than the sky. We're going to lighten it all up, and we're not worried at all about the sky. At this stage, we just want to see lots of nice detail in these rocks. So first let's just sort out our color temperature, and we'll just quickly set the white balance to daylight, which just warms it up a touch, and then we're going to move our exposure slider to plus 2.2 stops. And there you can see that although we've blown out those clouds completely, losing all detail there, the landscape itself is looking much better. Next up, we'll take a look at the shadow slider, and before I move that, I'm just going to click on the shadow clipping warning box there, and you'll see all these blue pixels that appear are showing us where we've got complete and utter black. There's no detail in any of these areas at all, so we want to minimize them really just by clicking on the shadow slider and moving it down to about 2. There we've still got a few of these blue pixels, but they've mostly disappeared. Now just a quick word of warning about these exposure controls that we're using in our RAW conversion. It's best not to push the exposure slider in particular over about 2 stops, because if you do, you're likely to introduce lots of digital noise into the picture. And this can end up looking rather ugly and masking the actual real detail that's there. It'll all end up looking rather speckly, and you won't be able to tell the natural texture of this rock, for instance, from the digital interference that's coming from the conversion. So try and keep your exposure between about plus and minus 2 stops. Further down the palette, we're going to leave the brightness at 50, the contrast at plus 25, and the saturation at 0. And then we'll come down and click Open. The RAW conversion will open into Elements, and then we'll just come up to File and down to Save As. Now here we just need to choose a place where we're going to save the first of our RAW conversions. So in this case I'm just going to call it Stanage 1. We'll save it as a JPEG at level 10, and then we can close the shot down and reopen our RAW file again, Stanage Edge, which will return us into the camera raw interface. This time around we're going to leave most of the sliders as they were, except the exposure slider, which we're going to bring down to minus 1.5 stops. And as I did that, you'll have seen a lot of that detail returning to the sky. And we're also going to push the contrast up to plus 50. And just like the first raw conversion, there's no need to worry about how dark and shadowy the landscape's becoming, because in this case all we're interested in is the sky. Click Open, and then once again we'll come up to File and down to Save As, and this time we're going to call it Stanage 2. Click Save, choose level 10 once again, and then we can close the conversion down and get started blending the images together in Photomatics. So let's open up the Photomatics interface, and when you do that, on the left hand side you should see a window called Workflow Shortcuts. In this case we want to click on Exposure Blending, and clicking on the Browse button in the little dialog box we'll find our two raw conversions, that's Stanage 1 and Stanage 2. Click Open and then click OK. We don't need to worry about clicking on the Align Source Images box because both of our conversions came from exactly the same file. Therefore all the pixels will be in the same place and there shouldn't be any ghosting or other little aberrations to worry about. Just click OK and that'll open up the Exposure Blending interface. Now as you can see, this is a pretty uncomplicated looking dialog box. There's not too much to worry about, but starting up here on the top left we've got some various options for how the two JPEG files that we loaded in are going to be blended together. First up there's Average, which if you click on it produces a pretty mediocre result really. The landscape's a bit grey and there's not much detail being returned in the sky, so we're not particularly interested in that one. Highlights and Shadows Auto gives us a little bit more dynamic range, but there's also a rather nasty and harsh halo going around there along the top of the rocks. And as the name suggests, it's not an option that we can easily control, so best left alone, that one. Highlights and Shadows Adjust is probably the favourite option if you want to produce a more traditionally photographic look for the image, because as you can see, although we're bringing back quite a lot of detail in the landscape and the sky, it's not pushing the results particularly hard. There are some quite dark areas up here at the top of the rocks that could be further exploited. Highlights and Shadows 2 images allows you to see the results from just two blended exposures if you've loaded in more than two raw conversions or more than two separately shot images. We won't go into that one here, we'll just come down to Highlights and Shadows Intensive. And as you can see, comparing that to the Highlights and Shadows Adjust option, it produces results that are much more dramatic. There's a lot more detail going on in that sky for starters, and it's also pushing the detail in the landscape quite hard as well. Now, whether you pick the Adjust version or the Intensive version all depends on how you want your finished image to look. Do you want all this extra contrast, which can look a little bit unreal, or do you just want to simply blend the two exposures together, producing something more subtle? In either case, you'll find that by moving these sliders around, you get more and less dramatic effects. Here, pushing the strength up quite high is causing something of a halo around the rocks, although it is still quite subtle, and I think we can probably get away with it. And pushing the blending point up is going to lighten up the foreground. Obviously pushing them in the reverse direction gives us darker and sort of weaker results. But the other thing to point out, of course, is that the settings you use on these sliders are very much dependent on the individual image you're using. In this case, and for this image, I found that using a strength of 2 and a blending point of 10 seemed to work rather nicely. There is something of a sort of a very vague and loose halo going on up there along the top of the rocks, but I don't think it's particularly displeasing. It just looks like a graduated filter's been used really, although it has led to us losing some detail at the top of the rocks. And you can see that if I just click the loop onto that area, we get a close-up. We can move our loop around to check different areas of the picture. So if you want a subtle and traditional approach, go for the Adjust tab. But we're now going to have a look at the Intensive option, which if I click back onto the same area again with the loop there, you'll see we're retaining a lot more detail. However, the Intensive version can also give rise to some haloing, which you can just about see around here. Whether that bothers you or whether you think it's too extreme will very much depend on your taste and, of course, the image that you're using. But I think it's kind of looking okay, and we can probably even afford to push that strength up to about 2 before the results start to look particularly unsightly. If you push it up much higher, you can start seeing some rather extreme effects, so leaving it on something around 2 or 3 should do nicely. Pushing the radius slider to the left gives us a more localized effect. You can see the picture looks altogether more gritty if we do it that way. So pushing it a little to the right usually pays off. We'll push it up to around 60, I think, in this case, which should work quite nicely. Okay, so when you're happy with the look of the blending that you're doing, all you need to do is come down to where it says Process, give that a click, and depending on the speed of your computer, you'll get a little readout of how long it should take. So click Process, and within a few seconds, you should get something that looks a bit like this, with the highlight and the shadow detail all nicely combined. And that's all there is to using the exposure blending mode in Photomatix. As you can see, it's very easy to use and very easy to get some effective results that we can further enhance in Photoshop or Elements. So just come up to File and down to Save As, and we'll record the blended file into the same folder that we saved our raw conversions. We'll just call it Stanage Blend and hit Save. And then we can close down the file in Photomatix, come back into our Elements interface and open it up in there, and make just a few enhancements to improve the image as a whole. And all we're going to do really is make a couple of levels adjustments to the sky and the landscape, because if I just come up to Enhance, down to Adjust Lighting and choose Levels, taking a look at the histogram representing the whole image, we don't really, at the moment, have a full range of tones in there. We'll just cancel out of that one. So first I'm just going to make a quick selection of the sky using the polygonal lasso, just making a selection of that top left corner there, then up to Select, down to Feather, and input a radius of 200 pixels. And then I'm going to darken off this portion of sky, but before I do that I'm just going to hit Ctrl and H on the keyboard, and that's going to hide those marching ants, meaning that when I come up to Enhance, down to Adjust Lighting and pick Levels, and then move that black point slider in, along with the middle slider a little over to the right, we can see that sky darkening off in a really pleasing and sort of moody way, but we don't have those marching ants getting in the way and distracting us. Hit OK, and then make sure that you do hit Ctrl and H again on the keyboard to reveal the marching ants, and Ctrl and D to deselect them, to get rid of them, because you don't want to be leaving them active and hidden and forgetting all about them. That'll stop you making adjustments to other parts of the image. Cracking on, we'll make a similar selection, this time of the landscape, back up to Select, down to Feather, using 200 pixels again, and just like before, pressing Ctrl and H to hide the marching ants, and then Enhance, Adjust Lighting and Levels, and then I'm going to move that white point slider in, as well as moving the middle slider again just a touch to the right. Click OK, Ctrl and H, and then Ctrl and D, or up to Select and Deselect to get rid of the marching ants. And there, though we've darkened the sky and lightened the foreground a little, we've still got an image with a really nice dynamic range, plenty of detail in the highlights and the shadows, and it's all combining to make a very pleasing landscape image. So once you've had a practice on the start image, why not have a go at combining your own multiple raw conversions using the exposure blending mode in Photomatix, because it's a really quick and easy way of creating nicely balanced landscape images. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.